So there are many ways in which play can be useful, but not necessarily in the way that you see it. So play fighting, it was thought, well, they're practicing playing for when they have to do real fights as adults. But studies showed that these animals that are engaged in play fighting doesn't really help them when they fight for real.
So are you telling me that cats that chase more lasers don't also end up bringing more birds home because they've honed their skills necessarily?
No, studies have actually shown that giving kittens playful experiences with the predatory play, where they has absolutely no effect on how good hunters they are when they're adults.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I'm your host, Shane Mauss. Joining me today, got a special guest, Jordan Burghardt, who I'm going to have kind of introduce himself. But how I know Gordon is because during COVID, I've been sitting in on a poker night every other Saturday with some academic friends and meeting some new people. And Gordon has a ton of interesting research, including we're going to be talking about a few things today, including anthropomorphism and play in animals. He has a book, The Secret Social Lives of Reptiles, but I think we're maybe going to do a whole separate reptile episode with Gordon and his co-authors another time. So we're going to be talking about play today, which is a little bit fitting because we play poker together. Gordon, before you kind of introduce your background, the people probably want to know, how would you rate my poker skills?
Well, I would say above mediocre.
That's so generous. I would rate them below mediocre. I actually love play. I love board games. I like chess, and I enjoy gambling. I like blackjack, but there's something about poker I can't get myself to care that much about. I like the social. I like hanging out with you guys and chatting and everything. I can't get myself to care enough to make the right moves. I like to make the exciting moves and play a little recklessly, so I always end up losing money, as Gordon can testify to. But that's that. Anyway, Gordon, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience and give them a little bit of your background?
Okay, I was raised in the Midwest in Wisconsin, actually, and went to college and got a degree, undergraduate degree in a new program called biopsychology, and then got my PhD in that area, but actually studied snake behavior. And I've been very interested in reptiles all my life, but I've sort of remained at the cusp between biology and psychology for the rest of my career, and I still continue my interest in reptiles, which I did my early research back in the 1960s, believe it or not. So
where in Wisconsin were you from?
I was born in Milwaukee.
Oh, nice.
In the Bayview area of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I went to University of Chicago. That was 100 miles south. And then I came down into Tennessee, where I've remained for over 50 years now at the University of Tennessee. And I'm in both the departments of psychology and ecology and evolutionary biology. So again, it's that relationship between the biology and the psychology that's always been my interest, and that I sort of remained in. Even though being a person who studies reptiles in a psychology department, you get a lot of concerns. You psychoanalyze snakes, that sort of.
Yeah. Well, so So we're kind of going to be talking about play quite a bit today. I do. So you study a lot of play in animals, and you also have it's kind of important to you. You've been critical of some of the anthropomorphizing that happens in research. Could you maybe set that up a little bit, and maybe some of the why we have to be careful not to anthropomorphize too much in situations?
Well, anthropomorphism, when I was started off in school, there were two sins that you shouldn't do as a scientist studying animal behavior. One was being anthropomorphic, and the other was relying on anecdotes. So those are the two sins, and they go back to like the early 19th or late 19th century and the post-Darwinian enthusiasm for looking at continuity between animal and non-human animal and human behavior. Even Darwin got very anthropomorphic in looking at relationships between the emotions and mental lives of other species and ourselves for the goal of focusing on continuity and their similarities, but often based on, at that time, really poor methods to study behavior. There wasn't really, motion pictures or movies or video to document behavior, and it was very easy to apply human-type processes, concepts to other species. And in fact, anthropomorphism is the attribution of non-human characteristics to non-human beings, non-human things, and that includes the weather, that includes non-animate things. And actually, anthropomorphism began as a way of looking at God, because in many religions, we anthropomorphize God. We give God, gender, male gods or female gods. We give them thoughts and
looks
feelings.
like us, just bigger muscles and a beard, and up there just like a larger size, and kind of those sorts of things, like pictures of Zeus or something like that.
Right, and the idea of a personal God, a God who's looking out for you, someone that you love and admire, and these are very anthropomorphic kinds of tendencies that seem to be pretty endemic into human psychology, and we apply it also to, as I say, inanimate things. We talk about ecology. We talk about insulting the flag, for instance. We use this in general terminology. And then when you start looking at animals and how they may be feeling or responding, we often then fall back on our own, what we would feel like or what we would do in those situations, which may not always be wrong at all, but we just have to be critically aware of those kinds of interpretations.
Because there's also, you could err on the other way as well, which is, what would you call that, like Anthro Denialism or something like that, where maybe there's people that like to think, oh well, humans are at kind of the pinnacle of life or evolution, or we have dominion over animals, and there's also been a risk of people not considering that animals are actually experiencing some of the same things. And we even see this amongst humans, where we have dehumanization of outgroups, and whether that's different cultures or religions or race or what have you, we tend to sometimes go the opposite way and not realize that other minds are sharing similar attributes as our own.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, I wrote with a former grad student, Jesus Rivas, a paper we call Anthropomorphism by Omission, where we're so concerned about being, objective and non-judgmental in a way that we don't see the similarities. And so I've been very influenced through my career by an Estonian biologist called Jakob van Uexküll, who came up with the idea of the Umwelt, that all species, all different people, have their own way of looking at the world and being impressed by the sensory stimuli around them, and that we need to really make an effort to understand each species umwelt as well as each individual's a way of viewing the world. So it's a perceptual side of things that we need to look at, that other animals don't see the world the same way. They see things that we don't, like bees see ultraviolet light patterns. What's a white flower to us has many structural units and complexity to a bee or to other species. Many mammals don't see colors the way we do, and their visual ability.
Humans don't have the same kind of olfactory senses as many of the mammals out there, and kind of the use of it in navigating our world to the extent that many other mammals do.
Look at bats, and many rodents have ultrasonic hearing on vocalizations. So they're chatting away and communicating that we are completely oblivious to. And that has consequences. For instance, in animal laboratories, where you keep rodents who are very sensitive to vocalizations, ultrasonic vocalizations, yet we can have machinery and air conditioning systems and so on that are generating really loud sounds that we can't hear, but could be really obnoxious and harmful to the other species. Yet because we seem, we can't experience it, or it doesn't exist, that is a major error. So that's what we call by anthropomorphism by omission, forgetting that other species may be sensitive in ways that are alien to us.
That's so interesting. Wow. Yeah, there's this new, I haven't watched all of it. I started a little bit. There's a new David Attenborough documentary that came out. And I know, like, there's some compromises made making things entertaining for the general public, but the premise, how well they're executing it, is, I haven't watched enough to know, and I certainly might not have the eye for some of the mistakes they might be making. But the premise of the documentary is taking modern technology and trying to find a way of translating animals' perception in a way that we can understand, using like infrared cameras and that sort of thing. It's really interesting. You might enjoy it. And for listeners, it might be worth checking out.
Yeah, people have been looking at this for some time now, trying to, and again, it goes back to von Uschel, trying to portray what the same scene would be to a dog, to a human, to a fly. And the different stimuli are differently salient to those to these different organisms, and so how we see the world is then shaped by these ways that the stimuli have not only are salient to us, but we've evolved certain ways of viewing the world that are both species specific and then unique to each of us.
It must be such a tough balance trying to figure out what side of that coin one is erring towards, where if you take something, you could see something that three different things going from point A to point B. One flies, one swims, one walks on land. And one way of looking at it is like, well, this is all the same sort of behavior. This is all just a way of moving from one place to another place. And then from another perspective, you look and go, well, swimming is completely different than flying, which is completely different than walking or running. And how do you kind of find that balance?
Well, that's what makes science interesting, is that there are no simple answers for many of these questions, and particularly when we get into the behavior of other species. As well, we know the difference between, swimming and walking, running, and maybe gliding and doing things that my daughters do, but I didn't, like the hang gliding and things like that. Obviously, one of the reasons you do that is to get different sensory experiences as well as thrills and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, which transitions quite nicely into play. Let's talk about play and some of your research. Maybe a little bit of history of play, because I imagine it's one of those things. So one of my best friends, Peter McGraw, he got into humor research, or he got into humor research some years ago. And one of the things that I've seen him struggle with is getting academia to take humor research seriously, simply because he's studying comedy. Comedy's this funny thing. It doesn't get taken seriously. What's the point in studying why we laugh or what makes us laugh? And I imagine the same sort of thing is easy to dismiss when we see adolescent mammals jumping about in a playful way, and we go, oh, that's just some ridiculous behavior. That's not as important as tackling the predator or tackling the prey or running from the predator, and probably doesn't get taken it quite as seriously.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And I've been concerned about that when talking with biologists, trying to get them interested in play. Well, there are several things. First of all, until recently, almost everybody said play just occurs in some mammals, lots of young mammals, and maybe some birds. But other than that, it's not part of the animal kingdom. And since most biologists are interested in sort of general processes that, pervade all of life, then play doesn't seem to be, it's just a marginal thing only found in some smart animals and so on. And then also play being sort of not important or frivolous or fun, therefore means it's not a serious scientific subject. And although scientists might balk at admitting that that's why they haven't been very interested in play, but that's certainly the case. Take evolutionary psychology, which is, I know, an area that you're interested in. You look at most of the evolutionary psychology books, you find virtually no treatment of play in evolutionary psychology textbooks. The one I've used, and the last time I taught the course this spring, called The Evolution of Human Behavior, play isn't even in the index. And I sort of talk about play quite a bit in that class, and it's a good textbook. But you can go through, and I don't want to mention names, but play has been very much neglected in much of the evolutionary psychology literature. They like to focus on sex. They like to focus on mating and jealousy and fighting and crime, serious subjects, but not on those things that actually may be more critical, in my view, to how we evolved as a species, and have features like cooperation and fair play and meta-communication, a lot of things that I think we learn and other species learn in their interaction with each other is through play. Learning to read signals, how to respond, and this sorts of thing.
Yeah, usually the stuff that gets highlighted within evolutionary psychology that's close to play would be kind of categorized under, say, a courtship behavior like dance or something like that, or sports are some kind of status recognition sort of thing, but that kind of tends to neglect why, say, juveniles, like kids, are maybe playing like cops and robbers, or jumping around and playing the floor is lava, so those sorts of things aren't talked about as much.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that people just don't know how to approach play, and because there's been few studies until recently that actually show definitively adaptive functions of play. So there's been a search and arguments for years on what is the function of play. Why do animals play? As if there's a single function. And one of the ideas, well, it's practicing instincts for adulthood, or it's learning social skills, or there's been lots of proposed benefits of play, but very little evidence, definitive evidence, until recently. And now what we're finding is that there are lots of different kinds of play. It's a very heterogeneous category, and that a play may have no functions, or several functions, or in one type of play might have a certain kind of function, and a different kind of play may have a different type of function. And so there's no simple answer. And so again, we're now making pretty good progress into some of the functions of play, involving, aiding courtship behavior and reproduction, or aiding in learning certain types of skills, or how to interact socially, or to buffer oneself against stress. That's one of the things I think we're going to find out more and more, that kids and animals that engage in playful interaction, vigorous playful interactions, are more able to resist stressful events. And people have noted the correlation between increasing levels of depression and so on in young people. And mental problems, that this may be exacerbated by the fact that there's so little outdoor physical recreational play that they can get themselves immersed into. And parents are afraid of the kids getting injured, or dangers being outside, and so on. Plus, we have the cell phone and the video games, and which again have certain advantages, but they are very addictive and very much take kids from sort of interacting with each other socially, as well as outdoors and physical activity.
It's such a mismatch with our modern world and our evolved world, and just when I think about technology or playing a game or something, then on a phone, which I'm not criticizing or denying that they're fun or any. We play poker together, but it's almost like hijacking the reward system, or turning play into a easy concentrate or something like that of what would be normal behaviors. You would go outside, and it would take you a little bit more time and effort and physical activity to get that same fix, in a way.
Right. Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah. So when you talk about how do you approach play, that is an exceptionally important question. That seems like a big a big, ambitious, challenging domain to cover. But what do you think about when it comes to approaching play and how to research it?
Well, when I first got into play behavior, I'll give you some my personal anecdotes, I guess. One was that I started off by looking at reptile behavior, young reptiles. So I just did a lot of work on baby snakes and their feeding behavior and anti-predator behavior. We studied iguanas in the field and how early behavior. And I saw things like curiosity and so on, but I never really saw anything that I would call play initially. And then when I came down to Tennessee, there weren't that many students interested in doing research on snakes and psychology department and the reptiles. But the park at that time, the Smoky Mountains, was having, Great Smoky Mountain National Park was having a bear problem. this is before they came up with bear-proof garbage cans and things like this. And bears were hanging on the sides of the roads. There's one road that goes through the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and they had bear jams because the bears would come out, beg for food. People would feed them. Cars are just backed up, and it was got to be a real problem. So the Park Service decided they were going to have a 10-point plan. And some of those aspects of that 10-point plan struck me as a little strange. Like they were going to outfit all the park rangers with baseball bats. And so when the park ranger came across one of these bear jams, they would go out with his baseball bat and bop the head on the bears as a way of, quotes, reinstating their instinctive fear of humans or natural fear of humans.
Right.
And that, of course, didn't work because a bear can see the rangers with their distinctive hat at quite a distance and take off. So I did things like suggest, well, maybe you should have an undercover ranger if that's how you're going to do it. Though I think that's really a bad way to solve the problem. And they said, oh no, we can't do that because if you're on a park service, you have to wear the uniform. But anyhow, one of the 10 events that they wanted us that they proposed, one was research. And since I was sort of an own behavior guy here in Tennessee, and I thought, well, I could maybe get involved in some research at the park. And I won't go through the whole story, but we ended up, the park rangers found some abandoned bear cubs. And since I was the guy who was interested in the bear behavior, I ended up raising 2 bear cubs in my house at home because they had no facilities for them. And,
amazing.
And they were the most playful animals. These girls, they were Kit and Kate. They were the most playful animals to have, and they had in our house. And so that really got me attuned to play. It was very important. I did a paper on the development of behavior in these bear cubs. And finally, we got some money to build an enclosure up in the park and continue keeping the bears when they got hundreds of pounds of age. But that stuck with me that these were super playful animals. Well, then some articles. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Can we just take a little bit of a tangent here because I want to be more playful. You raised 2 bears. I mean, I feel like you glossed over that a little bit. First of all, before listeners go off and get themselves some bear cubs to play, what are the pros and cons of raising some bear cubs in your home?
Well, this is something that could never be done today, clearly. But these bears, they had to be fed milk every several hours and the bottles and formula and everything. So somebody had to take care of them. And what happened was a ranger came across 4 abandoned cubs, 4 cubs alone under a log, and thought, well, maybe the mother had been driven away by dogs or something like this, and so left, came back the next day, and 2 of the cubs were gone. And so he got concerned that, these cubs are going to, die if the mother has been driven off, maybe by dogs or scared or poachers killed her or something. So he brought them back into the to the main office headquarters of the park, and then we were contacted. Some of us who are working with bears, and I ended up having them at home. And
what were their names?
Kit and Kate.
Kit and Kate.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. All right. I don't know if it was who gave them the name, maybe one of my students. But Kit and Kate, they were girls. And I said they were my first twin girls because later on I have identical twin daughters.
Oh, wow. Now, how long did you, how long, by the way, we'll get back to your research. I'm just curious. I didn't know this about you. yeah, how long did you raise them in the? You said you got an enclosure eventually. How big did they get before you were like, okay, we got to get these bears out of the house?
Well, we probably had them a number of months. I mean, they were probably we probably had them about for I can't come up with the exact details now, but probably about 6 months. And they got pretty big in over those 6 months. And then we couldn't keep them. I designed a sort of an enclosure like a playpen, only it had a roof on it and everything, and a little stronger than the ones that we use for babies, human babies. And so that's where we kept them in, except when we were home, we left them out running around. We had some other. We had the bears. They got into some problems. They could get into any door, open up any cabinets. I mean, we just couldn't let them out around in the house when we weren't there, because they would they were so smart. That was another thing that impressed me about them. But they were always playful. They were very engaged with each other. But we also noticed that they would have locomotor play, running around, jumping and things. That they'd also then objects. They would really go through my wife's purse and stuff like this, dump all the contents out and explore and everything. And then they would also chase and wrestle and so on with each other and with us. So we actually had quite a bit of a film. We actually put together a film that I showed at a conference many years ago with them playing with us. I would get in the closure, even when they're out in the Smokies, and they were now maybe 250 pounds or so, and wrestle with them and so on. Which was pretty interesting.
So this is kind of this paradigm shift for you in a way. This is this insight and perspective that probably changed the course of your life and your research in a lot of ways, and sent you down this path.
Right. Well, we studied the bears for quite a while, and a number of students did their dissertations and theses on them. We, for instance, were the first ones to really document experimentally that bears have really good color vision. It was thought that like dogs, or they have such teeny little eyes and so on, they really just are smell-oriented animals, but their hearing's really very good, and it turns out that they have really good form and color discrimination abilities. And now that's been shown in quite a few other species of bears also. But that was sort of the groundwork that laid back on the play. But then I was visiting the National Zoo, and they had an exhibit of this huge Nile softshell turtle, and it had a label on it saying the oldest basketball player at the zoo. And there was a really creative zoo curator who had been trained in reptile behavior, but he was the reptile curator at the zoo. And they had this big turtle in this sort of barren concrete tank, and it was sort of self-injuring itself and mutilating itself. And so he had the idea that no one really had before, that maybe the turtle was bored. And so he started providing objects, hoops and balls and basketballs and things like this, and the turtle would knock them around and engage in activities, playful activities with these objects, and then the self-injurious behavior really fell off dramatically. And so we documented, filmed that, and that was sort of the first paper that really helped document that turtles could play, a reptile could play. And this started changing the idea that play was found only in mammals and some birds, but may also be far more widespread in the animal kingdom, evolutionarily. And but in order to get to this position, you have to come up with a definition of play. What is play? And that turns out not to be a simple issue. And you go into early literature and you'll find all kinds of definitions of play. Most of them only apply to certain kinds of play. They'll talk about like social signals and so on. Well, that's only works for social play. So try to come up with a generic definition that could cover all play, including phenomena that you would not think were play, and also in species that you couldn't play, like fish, for instance, was sort of a challenge. And so that's where one of the things that I had to really start and to come up with what I ended up coming up with 5 criteria for identifying play that seem to apply across the board. And they've been sort of fairly widely adopted now, and people now have identified and recorded play in invertebrates, octopus, you're wearing an octopus. There's some of the best play studies were done by a fellow in Austria, Michael Kuba, and a Canadian woman, Jennifer Mather, and some others identifying playful activities in octopus. And there's evidence
I
now.
know a lot of people saw the Octopus Teacher over the course of the last year, and I don't know if you've gotten a chance to see it yet, but beautiful little documentary.
Right. No, won the Oscar, I think.
Yeah.
And I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but I know people who have, and they're very much impressed with it. But there's quite a bit out there now on play in octopuses and in other invertebrates and fish. It's now been well documented, and in lizards and crocodilians. Even in snakes, there might be some playful behavior, although it's harder to identify in an animal that can't do too much in terms of facial expressions and moving its limbs and stuff like this. So it makes it a little harder to identify. That was one of the things that I think helped broaden our interest in play, so that it's not just something that's found in a few isolated endothermic vertebrates and thus not of general interest, but it really may be much more foundational. And when you find that invertebrates and vertebrates who have been separated by 600 million years at least of evolution still have comparable behavior, means that there's something going on there. It also means that play is not a homologous kind of activity, something that evolved once in one way and that was it. But it's like eyes and limbs and other things. They evolved repeatedly in
independent of one another, like flight and flight of some things had. Some things started with gliding. Some things had feathers for warmth that eventually used to flight, and there was a few different ways that that the evolution of flight took off. Pun intended, I guess. but so play is the same way. So how do you categorize? You said that there's 5 ways in which you categorize play. What are the 5? And if you don't mind, because I already had a look at them, I'd like to dig into each one individually a little bit, if we could, instead of just quickly listing them. If you're up for that.
Yeah, so if you want to get into the details, probably the first criterion is that the play is incomplete. Let's get a little more technical maybe than you want, but incompletely functional in the context in which it is expressed.
Right. So it's not directly in terms of utility. This play is not directly benefiting it in terms of like spreading genes or something in this very moment. This is something that's maybe training practice that's maybe will have downstream utility, but right in this very moment isn't benefiting.
Right. See, one of the first people say, well, play is something that doesn't have function. It has no function because it's just frivolous, or it's just done for its own sake, which can be true. But how do you separate what you call play fighting from regular fighting? Well, there are certain criteria that you can show that one's really agonistic and injury producing, and the other is not. But when you see animals engaging in play, or throw a cat with a mouse, for instance, or a rubber ball, it's not trying to hunt or eat or kill that animal, but so it's incompletely functional. But it may be functional. It may be adaptive in helping the animal learn how to respond to objects, learning body motor coordination. It may have an exercise function, so you may engage in vigorous activity that doesn't seem to be functional, but it's actually helping your heart. It's helping your bodily functions in some other way. So there are many ways in which play can, as I say, be useful, but not necessarily in the way that you see it. So play fighting, it was thought, well, they're practicing playing for when they have to do real fights as adults. But studies showed that these animals that are engaged in play fighting doesn't really help them when they fight for real. Similarly, early studies showed that.
So are you telling me that cats that chase more lasers don't also end up bringing more birds home because they've honed their
well,
skills?
I don't know about the laser part, but no, studies have actually shown that giving kittens playful experiences with the predatory play, where they has absolutely no effect on how good hunters they are when they're adults.
Wow. Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
These were studies done back in the 70s, and that helped sort of seal the fate. Well, it can't be very important then, right? But
weird.
That might actually be important in different different ways, including just getting rid of boredom. That's the fact that you find play in many species much more common in good captive environments, in zoos and so on, than you do in the wild. It could be due to the fact that the animals in captive environments, if they're well fed and healthy, the predators are kept at bay, they get bored. And so then you start engaging in activities as a way of self-stimulation, of engaging in doing something in the world.
Yeah, so I can blame my parents' stable upbringing for my thrill-seeking behavior. Essentially, I'm the elephant that needs the barrel to bat around in the zoo, or I go mad. That's fascinating. I would have, total honesty, I would have predicted just the opposite. I would have predicted this as training for predator behavior or something like that. That's fascinating. All right, so that was the context. So that was number one.
Right.
And then,
let me see what I've. One would be the fact that we consider the behavior sort of spontaneous or fun, or something that is done for its own sake, or reinforcing. You can use any one of those terms, but the behavior somehow has some internal motivating aspect to it. So it's not that something forced to do. Some people may not want to use the word voluntary or spontaneous. Somehow, nothing is spontaneous. You could, but the idea that, or that it's fun or rewarding or reinforcing.
Right. So rather than giving a light and like a reward or something to a rat, and it's hitting the lever and getting the reward, or delivering a shock, so it's avoiding some behavior, this is just the rat sitting in the cage, just using its own kind of general curiosity board, trying to investigate the area or something.
Well, rats are actually a very interesting animal because they're the most studied animal in terms of play behavior. Most people don't realize that, but there are literally thousands of papers on play behavior in rats. They're very playful for about 4 or 5 weeks of their life before they really hit adulthood. And they engage in this behavior spontaneously and repeatedly for hours at end. And so if you take 2 rats and you raise them in isolation, but then you give them play dates, half an hour a day or something, they'll just engage and play almost continuously for that period of time. No one has to teach them. They know what to do. And it develop as they get older. They change the type of tactics that are used. A good friend, Serge Pellis, and a number of others have devoted their careers basically to looking at behavior from the 4th to the 8th, 7th week or so of life of rats, and getting now into what are the brain chemistry and the brain regions involved. For instance, I was thought that play was a product of intelligence and the higher brain features. You can take a rat and remove the cortex entirely, decorticate a rat pup. People have done this. I don't.
Yeah.
And you find that the rats develop play behavior normally. They play. They have the motivation and interest in playing, and they do it. What happens is that they don't adjust their play and change it as they get older. They can't sort of play with play, you might say, or build on it. But the motivation, all the movements, all the tactics initially are there, but they just don't, they can't build on those. And so other brain areas, so that's where the cortical involvement comes in. But the basic play itself is really structured in the lower brain stems, you might say, areas, the lower cortical areas.
Kind of,
and a very important neurobiologist, 𝕊𝕐𝕐𝕒, wrote quite a bit on play as one of the 7 major emotions that goes back to early, for him it was early mammalian evolution, but that these were found in all mammals, and these are like rage and care and so on, but play was one of these 7 major underlying emotions of all, basically all endothermic vertebrates.
Do you know the other 7 off the top of your head?
I said rage, care, seeking is one.
It's okay. I won't put you on the spot, but that's interesting about
but there are several. But play is definitely one of them.
Well, what's interesting about the cortex is the cortex was kind of some of the last. It was later in the evolutionary processes, right? So play has been around and with us evolutionarily. Longer than one might suspect.
So in the vertebrates, they sort of relate it to the basal ganglia, certain parts of the, things in the amygdala and so on are heavily involved. But there are quite a few brain cells. It turns out the cerebellum is actually also very important in play behavior, which makes sense because it has to do with balance and integration of sensory information and so on. So that's the second criteria, that a play has some spontaneity and it's fun and it seems to be enjoyable, which is why when you talk about sports, as you brought up, they take a professional baseball player. Well, they're just playing a game, it's called. But if you got to go out, at a certain time and perform in a play, but if you don't really feel like it, it's not, then in one sense, that play criteria is not really being met. Although you maybe got into the sport and got into it out of the
play. Now you have to. Right. Oh, I play pickleball all the time, and every time that I'm playing, because I'm pretty hard on myself, when I'm playing, I often find myself having to internally remind myself, you're doing this for fun. You're supposed to be having fun right now. And that's funny. If I could, and I apologize that my style is a little bit tangential, but one thing that I imagine many listeners will have heard, because it's one of the few interesting science curiosities that's permeated through the zeitgeist, is the idea of the rat amusement park and addiction research, and this kind of correlates with the two topics that we've already kind of talked about so far, in boredom, and the idea of well, sure, every rat's getting addicted to cocaine or whatever in this very basic cage with nothing else to do, but you give it all this other stimulus and this ability to choose, and you don't see the same kind of rates of compulsion. Do you have any? I don't know where the studies are at on that. I don't know how much that stuff's been replicated, but do you have anything to say about that?
Probably not too much. We do know, for instance, that dopamine and some of the basal ganglia areas involved in play are also very close to the ones that are involved in addictions, in drug dependencies, and even behavioral addictions, and obsessive compulsive disorders, and so on. So the idea that play is just an unbridled good is probably not accurate. It can be tied to things that can go off trails. We talked about playing poker. Well, what starts as a playful activity can become a compulsive addiction that can, destroy lives. And I remember going to some of the gambling casinos, like in Las Vegas and so on, and you go into these big spacious rooms and you see these hundreds of people sitting there mechanically pulling down the levers, and you don't really get a feel that they're having fun. It's in maybe the more social games, like the blackjack and the poker, there's more social interaction, and maybe people get more pleasurable experiences. But sometimes you get the feeling that they're just being, dropping the coin, pulling the lever, and
got some intermittent rewards, and just
right, and that's a Skinnerian kind of stuff, right? But that's not play in what I would say, but it shows how play can devolve, you might say, into something that's not good. Even sports, like running. There are people who I know people who really got into the running, but every day, and they get to a point that if they don't run, it's like a withdrawal. It's they get that runner's high kind of situation that they become dependent upon, and so it's a little controversial about how comparable that is to drug highs and drug addictions and so on. But there might be similar changes going on in the brain chemistry.
So, all right. So we got two. What's number three?
Well, the third would be that play behavior, when you start looking at it, differs from the serious version of the activity, be it fighting or courtship or predatory hunting type of behavior, whatever it might be. It differs in either the way the behavior looks, the structure of the behavior, how it's performed. For instance, in like play, predatory play, you don't get to the point of the killing bite or the ingestion of the prey, right? It differs. It stops at a certain point. The other aspect is that young animals we see do a lot of play, and often they engage in predatory type behavior or anti-predator behavior or social fighting behavior before it could at all be adaptive for the animals to do that behavior. So it's temporally earlier in the life sequence than we would want to see it.
Gordon, you have the best ringtone I've ever heard. What's that? What do you got, a landline there?
No, that's a phone, and I can't figure out how to disconnect the phone, and the phone just came in, and I just got rid of it.
That's
sorry.
Okay. No, it's just making light of it.
So that third criteria would be that the behavior itself looks different. It's got some details that differ from the serious performance of the behavior, or it occurs earlier in life of the animal than it would be typically found. Serge Pellis, who I mentioned earlier, looked at play fighting in rats and real fighting in rats, frame by frame, very close analysis, and found that actually play fighting differs quite a bit from the real fighting in the targets that are chosen, how the animal orients, and so on. And in fact, he found that play fighting in rats is more similar to courtship behavior, adult courtship behavior, than it is to real fighting, adult fighting behavior. Again, that shows that the need to really look fine and find detailed ways at a behavior. And this was a landmark finding that look at the details of these behaviors, and they really can help you indicate that they're not the same thing, or they have different causal mechanisms or functions. So that's the third one. Do you want to go for 4?
Of course I
do. Okay, the fourth one would be...
What if we stopped at 3, like a real cliffhanger?
I can do these very fast. I do this.
No, I'm just kidding. No, we have like another 30 minutes. So,
okay.
It's totally...
Okay, so the fourth one would be that the behavior is repeated. It's not a one-off behavior. So if an animal comes up to an object, sniffs it, pushes it, and then leaves and never comes back again, that's not play. He was just checking it out. Is it something to eat? Is it something, that I want to interact with? But if it comes back and starts manipulating that object, moving it around, grabbing it, running around with it, interacting with it repeatedly, then I can call it play. Now, sometimes this behavior only occurs in a very short span in the animal's life, like a lot of these rodents that play only for a few weeks in their developmental trajectory. But the behavior has to be repeated. So that's not an obvious one, but it seems to really be
it's kind of teasing apart the difference between just general explanation and then also allowing for just mistakes. There's a difference between just tipping over a cup out of curiosity and kicking around a cup over and over again and batting it around or whatever. And so it's hinting at there's intentionality too behind this.
Right, and that's sort of been a sort of a contentious term, of course, in studying behavior, intentionality. And that
why?
sort of
Just
thing.
because it gets into issues of deterministic ideas and that sort of thing, and environmental versus genetic triggers, or?
Well, that was one of the terms that behaviorists would sort of eliminated. and intent upon involves purpose and then purposiveness, and it goes back to Aristotelian teleological explanations and so on. So people sort of avoided that, but it becomes now it's something that we can look at. And the final criterion is that play is something that is initiated when the animal is in a pretty good psychological or physical state. So if the animal is, starving, or it's really hungry, or it's under a serious threat from a predator, or the climate's really bad, the weather's really bad, play is less likely to occur. So if the animal is seriously stressed, and so on. So, for instance, studies have shown that monkeys in the wild play more, and in zoos too, in good weather than when it's bad weather, when it's cold or stormy or rainy. The climate seems to can trigger or encourage activities that we call play. Similarly, starving animals or sick animals don't often play. Kids that are in children's hospitals seriously ill, they often have clowns and sort of people coming in to try to get them thinking playfully, or at least something happy about their situation, or bring in some joy, things that you wouldn't do normally with the kid.
Now, what about kind of thrill-seeking behavior where you have like say otters going into shark-infested waters where you don't you're not seeing maybe the adults do it, or their young pups? Do otters have pups? Is that what we call the baby otters? I think so. But then the juveniles will go into, like, during certain times of development, they'll go into those kind of shark-infested waters as seemingly a way to kind of gain some life experience, or maybe advertise. And there's yeah.
I don't know about that specific example with otters, or whether the animals sort of intentionally go out into these environments, but there's a classic study by a fellow named Harcourt with seals, showing that seals would go into shallow waters and from the land, and play vigorously socially with each other. And this is the time when those seal pups would get attacked and eaten by sea lions, who would be lurking in the area. And it was sort of the major predatory risk of these animals was during play. And so it raises the question, well, then why do they still keep playing, or what are the advantages? We really don't know the details, but certainly if a large proportion of the seals were being killed by the sea lions, you'd think that would sort of become eliminated from the population. But
I mean, if a certain number is, would you think of some of that as being a little bit predator naive, and maybe I mean they kind of it's a bit of, see, now I'm going back to that's a really interesting finding with the cats, that it didn't equate to the direct utility in the future, because with something like the seals going in the water, you would think that maybe they're still just kids that are like trying to seek out and go out in the world on their own for the first time, and are a little bit predator naive. But also there's a little bit of fitness advertising potentially going on with that as well.
It could be. I mean, in many of these animals, particularly the males, get larger than the females, and they develop these harems. And if you're a successful male, you get a lot of matings, a lot of offspring, and most of them males don't get to that stage. So it could be that that experience they're getting through this play fighting has potential for big payoffs, even though there are also considerable risks.
Maybe the males go into those waters and pull that slot machine thing and some of them get all the harems.
Well, that's why the complexity you see in all these animals and the types of play, and we have to then relate it to their social system and all kinds of aspects. Their ecology, for instance. We know that animals that are, even in primates, those animals that are more folivorous and eating leaves, low nutritious diets, don't seem to play as much as the monkeys that eat a fruit-rich, energy-rich diet. And
well, those mammals are also more territorial generally. If you evolved toward a higher nutrient rich, more sought after, more scarce environment, typically they're more territorial. So would there be something to do with play attached to status and hierarchy there?
Territoriality is a little different from dominance hierarchies and hierarchical societies. So you can sort of have animals that are hierarchical. They may move around a lot, but they're not territorial in the sense of this animal sets up a territory to fight off other males or females to set up their own territories. We know that the social system can influence play. So studies have shown, for instance, that many monkeys have a very hierarchical system, like macaque monkeys, rhesus monkeys that are used so much in research, and some of those animals are very hierarchical, and although they are very playful as young, you don't see much adult play in some of these monkey species. There are other primate species that are even closely related, macaques, that have a more egalitarian social system, where they're less hierarchical, and you find much more adult play in those animals. So that's an interesting situation that we see in all primates. A lot of play in young animals, but only in some primates do we see play continuing into adulthood. And you can classify that into sexual play and non-sexual social play. And studies now have really pretty documented that the egalitarian monkey societies, primate societies, are much more playful as adults. And I sort of extended this idea to looking at human societies and artistic freedom. Because, art and music and dance and variety of these artistic expressions are much more prominent or develop much more richly in more egalitarian democratic societies than in authoritarian societies. You look at, what happened in Germany, Nazi Germany, with the degenerate art stuff, and in Stalinist Russia, where you had such brilliant composers like Prokofiev and Shostakovich really tied down, and what's happening in maybe happening in China with art. A more repressive authoritarian regime seems to be leery of a more playful, open society, and so and play, I think, is at the heart of the arts in respects.
It's interesting too that so many artists are so introverted in a lot of ways. How does play play out evolutionarily across social versus kind of non-social mammals. Is there a difference? Is that predictive of anything, or is it the case that social animals run the gamut of play, and so do non-social animals?
Okay, let me give you a little bit of the backstory. Go back to the bears and how I really got interested in play and theory of play. Initially was an article that came out, Brain and Behavioral and Brain Sciences, many years ago, on a review of play and some theoretical ideas on play, and it related play to, particularly looking at monkeys and so on, to the social, complex social, adult social society was really important for the evolution of play. But now I had been looking at my bears, and these were the most playful animals one could imagine when they were young, right? They were super playful. And yet bears are known for not being a very social adult, socially complex as adults. I mean, males get together with females, and then they leave, and then the females raise the babies, and there's a good tight social bond between the mother and the cubs. But they're not a socially complex animal as compared to a chimp society or something like that. And so, yet they were super playful. More so, perhaps, than many monkeys. So I posed it as a question. That can't, adult sociality then cannot be at the heart of either the origin or the functions of play. And I still think that we have a long way to go to understand the relationship between social organization and play.
I mean, just speaking for myself, and this is, anecdotal and anthropomorphizing, and I've just a great number of sins that I'm about to partake in here, but I feel a lot more imaginative by myself. I feel like there's a lot more there's not I think a lot of social situations kind of have inherent restraints on imagination, because socially you're kind of agreeing upon some like reality that's outside of it, where I just feel like you can be a little bit more playful by yourself. We sing in the shower, more freely, or we sing in our car a little more freely around than around others sometimes. And obviously karaoke, and everyone wants to advertise and stuff, but that's almost a different sort of thing going on. But neither here nor there, unless you have something to say about that. But I do have this idea that I like to, this is exceptionally speculative, about when kids play the floor is lava. I like using this example of kids will tear off the couch furniture or whatever and go and jump around on it and play the floor is lava. And to me, that's so interesting, because are you, much like the cats in the training, are you actually going to be in a situation where you're jumping around lava? No. Are you maybe going to ever need to be able to jump between rocks across a stream? Maybe. It's something close, but there's something really interesting about it, where you are, in your imagination, in your mind's eye, you are imagining a more threatening scenario that is made benign because if you were actually jumping across lava, this would not be a fun time. But there's something about kind of artificially raising the stakes of that jumping around that, in my opinion, probably would lead into intensifying muscle memory and coordination. Whereas if you didn't imagine the stakes being higher, maybe you wouldn't be as invested. And maybe that's something of what play is kind of doing.
Okay. When you get into, like with kids and so on, like you mentioned, but we get into the typology of play involving humans and social play, and sort of we talk about pretend play, for instance, social dramatic play, in which kids make believe they're different situations or they're different characters. I mean, acting and theater probably comes out of this these ideas. And watching my young girls grow up, they were really imaginative and would play these different characters and get involved. So I think that pretend play and this, what you talked, this imagination kinds of things, again, this could relate a little bit to the boredom issue, right? If you're in sort of, you're alone and you start developing scenarios or ways of stimulating yourself mentally, not just necessarily physically. And so I think that play is at the origin of our mental lives, particularly in humans. We go from behavioral play, which we see in other animals and in the infants and so on, to mental play. We can play with ideas. And we find this very useful. Which is the best way to go home tonight? You know, if I go this way, I'm going to run into this type of traffic, and at this time, we can go through scenarios in our mind rather than just play them out physically. And I think the source of that could very well be our physical playful behavior. For instance, I've been using gestures quite a bit, as do you, and there's ideas that our language ability is really facilitated by physical gestures. That, in fact, if you restrict people from making gestures when they communicate, they are less articulate, less creative in some ways. So that helped convinced me that there's a link between behavioral movement, behavioral aspects of our lives, and the mental transubstantiation, you might say, of some of those.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's well, there's a lot of oh man, I'm having a brain maybe I need to move more. What is it when we embodied cognition? Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
Yeah, that's a recent within the last 20 years that's really come to the floor. Again, given as my history, interest in the early history of the field, it goes back to one of the founding women in psychology, a woman named Washburn, who wrote a dissertation on this aspect back in 1916 or so, I believe. But then those ideas were sort of forgotten, and they're coming back to the fore.
So going back to tying some of the stuff together and anthropomorphism and everything. So when I think about let's go back to that lava example, which I don't totally buy as out of boredom, because here's why. Let me push back a little bit on that, not to be whatever, you know more than I do about this field, but clear up maybe some of my misunderstanding. I have we all do things like we make these straw men up. Like I'm sitting in a car, I'm driving, and I just had a fight with a significant other or a friend of mine, or there was this funny situation at a bar and I missed an opportunity for a joke or something like that, and I'm driving and I'm by myself and I'm imagining this person next to me, and I'm imagining having this discussion with them, and I'm usually winning whatever argument too. By the way, really, their arguments are just pathetic. The arguments I'm imagining them having, and so yeah, there's boredom there, but there's a little bit of there's a little bit of simulation of potential future events that happens, and sometimes you do imagine those scenarios, and then 6 months later you're in a similar conversation and you go, ooh, I already thought of this. I've already simulated this alone by myself, and you have that perfect line and it gets the laugh or you win the argument.
Well, one of the most creative people studying play over the years is Brian Sutton Smith, and he put forth the idea, particularly involving emotions in play, is what he calls that play allows you a safe area for, you might say, virtual emotions. And so you're sitting trying to recreate a conversation and seeing how it might have gone differently. Repartee and so on is playful in its way. And so a lot of play is involved in a way of us experiencing things in safe environments. So, having coordinated trips or with a guide or something like this, rather than going out on your own, is a way of sort of putting yourself in a little safety, but still allows yourself to sort of extend your experiences. Mm-hmm. Look at amusement parks. I mean, people love to go to, I did, to roller coasters and these really, and what do? You're screaming, right? And then you want to go back and do it again. And yet you're, in a way, for momentarily, you're terrified. You're involved in the really extreme emotions, but it's in a safe context. At least you hope it's safe.
You're strapped in to the thing, and there's a regulatory bodies that checked the strap that has strapped you in, and you're just flying. It's a little bit of a different scenario than, say, cliff diving or something like that, where there's a few more unknowns. Right.
Well, it's like, whitewater kayaking, which I like to do, but I'm not doing it much anymore. Very good. Mm-hmm. Versus rafting on a tour, right? So you go maybe through the same type of rapids, and it's still pretty thrilling, but you're with a guide, and you're all couched up with your life preservers and helmets and things like that. So you're getting some pretty extreme experience. Now, a lot of people don't even want to do that, even though they're told, hey, this is safe, Grandpa, you can do this. And maybe not. But we do, in our environments and our recreational activities, I think, try to, in a way, program things that allow us to experience stronger emotions, stronger experiences than I might normally do, or maybe in the past we did when we walked through the woods. We always had to be a little bit more fearful about what might be out there than maybe we do today. But those are sort of ideas that can be explored. But I think there's something to play as a way of getting a experience, even when you're wrestling and revolving you're getting your emotions, you're getting your neurochemicals stimulated in various ways.
Now, before, as I wrap up, and I do want to make sure and plug your book again, The Secret Social Lives of Reptiles, which we'll have you and the co-authors back on to talk about. And by the way, a lot of listeners, might have some reptile pets. They might live in a region where they might be in Florida with chameleons running around everywhere. I might go paddle boarding today. I might run into some turtles. And so, and not only is it just generally interesting to read about stuff like this, but in my opinion, it kind of enriches your life to learn about the environment that that you're around more generally. Plus, you'll sound more interesting in a conversation when someone comes over to buy your pet lizard, or to look at your pet lizard. But anyway, in terms of anthropomorphizing, let's go back to that floor is lava example. And when we know that individually, lots of kids do this, and I know that when I did it when I was a kid, I would have this qualia, this subjective experience, which I kind of had to imagine probably other kids were sort of having a similar-ish experience to. Does everyone see the same color of blue? We may never know, but I kind of have to imagine it's somewhat similar. Now, what when it comes to looking at saying like a cat or something pounce at something that's imaginary, or a deer jumping around in a pond, you kind of have to imagine that their internal processes might possibly be somewhat different, where they also have an imagination that kind of exaggerates things and simulates future scenarios that may not be precisely in line with an actual encounter that they're having, but an exaggerated thing. What is it? How do you navigate that, where it is easy to be looking at animals and researching and being like, well, this isn't falsifiable. This isn't. We can't study this. We can't know for certain that they're imagining this thing. Therefore, we can only judge things by this exterior behavioral kind of lens, and just judge their arms moving and make assessments based on that. How do you navigate that?
Well, before we had, the modern advances in neuroscience, you'd had to sort of do it by inference from behavior. Or you then would look maybe at the anatomical features of, well, does this animal have the physiology or the brain mechanisms that underlie such and such a behavior. But today, there's more and more work coming out on actually recording what is going on in the brain of people and animals as they engage in different kinds of activities. And so I see down the line where you might be able to actually make some pretty close analogical, homological statements about the similar brain processes going on in different organisms underlying the same kind of emotional experiences or mental processing. And so I think that's pretty exciting, and maybe a way of breaking out of that conundrum. But of course, when it comes down to it, we all are aliens from any other mind, right? I mean, right. When you smile, are you really smiling, or is it? So we can make pretty good inferences about what is going on, quotes, inside the minds of another human being, but we often make mistakes, and to our detriment. Right. And we also allow ourselves to be fooled. So when we go to a theater or see a movie, and we know those actors aren't really going through the experiences that they are portraying, right? But a good actor convinces us we're allowed to enter into that world, even though on another level we know that it's all fake. Mm-hmm. And so good con men, con women, are really good at deception of that kind, and I think politicians are probably are leading characters in that process also. Yeah.
Well, see, what's even more interesting is they might not even be aware that they're doing.
Well, that's the whole idea of self-deception,
right?
That Trivers and others have worked, and so you're really good at convincing other people if you are so convinced of the truthfulness of what you're saying that
Yeah, you have this Pavlovian kind of conditioning to, say, confidence or being like very, very self-assured and putting yourself out there and being convinced of the things that you're believing. Correct. Other people tend to believe it as well.
And that's a problem with, of course, of bringing in science into these discourses, because science, by definition, is that you're a little tentative. You never know the ultimate truth. We always might have to change our views based on new evidence that comes in, but that's not what a lot of people would really like to believe or to have to deal with. And we're seeing that with sort of the COVID things and Dr. Fauci and how he's been portrayed. Because if you change your mind, that means you were lying or deceptive or ignorant before. So that's something about the human condition that really is disturbing.
Yeah, sure is. It's interesting to me that most people with zero interest in science whatsoever just assume that any like scientists are these mad scientists plotting against them or whatever, which says a little bit more about what's going on in their lives than the objective reality of the situation. But then see some MD or chiropractor, someone sounding sciencey, but feeding into their conspiracy, and they see one video of that person and trust every single word that they're saying because it's the first time they've actually paid attention to something that sounds a little sciencey, which is usually a lot of word salad and not clearly explained stuff, but just a bunch of confusing terms specifically meant to get people lost in the weeds that people are suckers for. But that's neither here nor there, Gordon. Just me blowing off some steam with what I've seen through all of this. But I really appreciate having you on. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about your book or any of your other research or things that you want to direct people toward?
Not really. There's a lot of literature out there on play in animals and all its variations. There are new journals that have come out in the last few years. So there's a lot of literature out there, and I've written quite a bit, but many other people are contributing to our growing knowledge of play and all its diversity throughout the animal kingdom. And maybe awesome. Plants play too. Well, that's another subject.
Right. Awesome. Another conversation for another time. And I can't wait to have you back on to talk about lizards really soon. And thanks for joining me as you this is funny that you're cutting out right at the end. We're having some technical issues. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Gordon just happened to I'm going to see if there he is. Gordon, are you there?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, Gordon Burghardt, everybody, thanks so much, Gordon, for joining me. Thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people, and we will chat with you more next week.